The moment you do this, an avoidant stops running. Not because they suddenly become fearless, not because they wake up one morning and decide they are ready for intimacy, and not because you finally found the perfect words to make them understand how much you care. The moment an avoidant stops running is usually far less dramatic than people imagine. In fact, it often happens at the exact moment you stop doing what everyone thinks should work. Think about that for a second. Every relationship problem seems to come with the same advice. Communicate more, explain your feelings better, try harder, prove your loyalty, show consistency, demonstrate your love. Yet somehow, when it comes to avoidance, those very actions can produce the opposite result. The more you move toward them, the more they seem to move away. The more clarity you seek, the more confused you become. The more effort you invest, the more distant they appear. If you've ever felt trapped inside that exhausting cycle, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear may completely change how you understand avoidance. And if you're someone who enjoys deep psychological insights that help you see relationship dynamics in ways most people miss, make sure you're subscribed. That way, every time we uncover another hidden truth about human behavior, you'll be right here with us. What makes this experience so painful is that it rarely begins with distance. It begins with connection. There is warmth. There is chemistry. There are moments that feel surprisingly intimate. Sometimes it feels as though walls are coming down and trust is growing. Then suddenly something changes. The messages become shorter. The enthusiasm fades. The emotional availability that once seemed effortless begins disappearing piece by piece. You start wondering what happened. Was it something you said? Something you did? Did they lose feelings? Did they meet someone else? Your mind searches desperately for answers because the shift feels so abrupt. One day you feel close. The next day you feel like you're trying to hold on to someone slipping through your fingers. Most people respond to this uncertainty in the most natural way imaginable. They move closer, they seek reassurance, they ask questions, they try to reconnect. After all, if someone you care about is pulling away, wouldn't it make sense to bridge the distance? But this is where the cycle begins. The more unsettled you become, the more energy you direct toward them. The more energy you direct toward them, the more pressure they begin to feel. And before either person realizes what's happening, both are trapped in a dance neither truly understands. To understand why this happens, you have to understand what running actually means to an avoidant. Most people assume avoidance is about not caring. They interpret distance as indifference. They see withdrawal and conclude that feelings must be absent. But avoidance is often much more complicated than that. Many avoidants experience a strange contradiction. They crave connection while simultaneously fearing what connection requires. They want closeness, but closeness creates vulnerability. They desire intimacy, but intimacy threatens their sense of independence. The very thing they long for can also activate the very fears they spend their lives trying to manage. So when emotional intensity begins increasing, their nervous system can interpret that closeness as danger rather than safety. This doesn't mean they consciously think, "I need to run." Most of the time, the process is far more subtle. They simply begin feeling overwhelmed. They need space. They need distance. They need room to breathe. And because these feelings often operate beneath conscious awareness, they may not even fully understand why they're withdrawing. They only know that something inside them is telling them to create separation. What's fascinating is that the withdrawal usually starts long before you can see it. Most people believe the avoidant leaves first and then becomes distant. In reality, the emotional distancing often begins internally, weeks or even months earlier. The avoidant may still be texting, they may still be spending time with you, they may still appear invested on the surface, but beneath that surface something is already shifting. They start monitoring how dependent the relationship feels. They become increasingly aware of expectations. Small obligations feel larger than they really are. Emotional conversations begin feeling heavier. Future plans create discomfort they can't easily explain. What looks insignificant from the outside can feel enormous inside their mind. This is the hidden trigger behind withdrawal. It is not necessarily conflict. It is not necessarily commitment. It is the growing perception that emotional demands are increasing faster than their ability to tolerate them. And because avoidants value autonomy so deeply, the fear of losing themselves inside a relationship can become stronger than their desire to stay fully connected. The distance you eventually see is often the final stage of a process that started long before any obvious signs appeared. This is why chasing feels so logical and yet so ineffective. Imagine standing in front of a closed door, convinced that if you just knock a little louder, eventually someone will answer. That's exactly how most people approach avoidant behavior. They believe more effort will create more connection. They send longer messages. They explain their intentions. They seek reassurance. They try to solve the problem through communication. The tragedy is that these actions usually come from a beautiful place. They come from love. They come from care. They come from a sincere desire to repair the bond. But the avoidant often experiences those same actions very differently. What feels like love to one person can feel like pressure to another. What feels like reassurance seeking can feel like obligation. What feels like pursuing clarity can feel like losing freedom. So the harder one person pushes for connection, the stronger the other person's instinct becomes to create distance. Neither side is trying to hurt the other, yet both end up triggering exactly what they fear most. One fears abandonment, the other fears engulfment. One moves closer, the other moves away, and the cycle feeds itself over and over again until both people are emotionally exhausted. The most painful part is that many people unknowingly make the avoidant the center of their entire emotional world. Without realizing it, their mood begins depending on the avoidant's attention. Their confidence begins depending on the avoidant's validation. Their peace begins depending on the avoidant's consistency. Every text becomes significant. Every delay becomes meaningful. Every shift in energy becomes a source of anxiety. Gradually, life starts revolving around trying to understand, predict, and influence the avoidant's behavior. And this is the mistake almost everyone makes. Not because they are weak, not because they are needy, but because they genuinely care. The problem is that when one person becomes the center of your emotional universe, an invisible pressure enters the relationship. The avoidant begins carrying a weight they never agreed to carry. They start feeling responsible for emotions they cannot manage. They sense expectations they cannot consistently meet. And the more central they become in your world, the more trapped they begin to feel in theirs. This is why the moment that changes everything isn't usually a new conversation, a new strategy, or a new technique. It begins with recognizing that your entire emotional life was never meant to orbit around someone else's ability to stay close. And once that realization arrives, something remarkable starts to happen, not just within the avoidant, but within you. And this is where the story begins to turn. Not because the avoidant suddenly changes, but because you do. For so long, your attention has been locked onto their movements. If they came closer, you felt hopeful. If they pulled away, you felt anxious. If they responded warmly, your day improved. If they became distant, your mind spiraled. Without realizing it, you handed over the steering wheel of your emotional life. The avoidance behavior became the weather, and your inner world became the forecast. But eventually, after enough confusion, enough sleepless nights, enough analyzing messages and searching for hidden meanings, something shifts inside you. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, out of exhaustion. You begin to recognize that no relationship can thrive when one person is carrying all the emotional weight. You start asking a different question. Instead of asking, how do I get them to stop running? You begin asking, why have I been running after someone who keeps showing me they need space? That question changes everything, because it redirects your focus away from controlling another person's behavior and back toward understanding your own. This is the powerful shift that changes everything. The moment you stop organizing your life around the avoidance reactions is the moment the dynamic begins transforming. You stop monitoring. You stop chasing. You stop treating every interaction like a test you need to pass. And for the first time in a long time, your energy returns to you. At first, this shift feels strange, almost uncomfortable. You have spent so much time emotionally invested in managing the connection that focusing on yourself feels unfamiliar. But gradually, something remarkable happens. You begin rebuilding the parts of your life that were placed on hold. You reconnect with interests that have nothing to do with relationships. You invest energy into your goals. You strengthen friendships. You rediscover routines that make you feel grounded. Most importantly, you stop viewing your happiness as something that exists on the other side of the avoidance approval. And here's the fascinating part. Avoidants often experience this change very differently than people expect. Many assume independence pushes avoidance away further. In reality, healthy independence often creates the exact emotional environment they feel safest inside. Why? Because independence removes pressure. It communicates something deeply reassuring without saying a single word. It tells them, you are wanted, but you are not responsible for my emotional survival. For an avoidant, that distinction matters more than most people realize. The fear underneath avoidance is often not intimacy itself. It's the fear of becoming trapped, consumed, or responsible for needs they feel incapable of meeting. When they sense that someone has a stable emotional foundation outside the relationship, that fear begins losing its grip. They no longer feel like every interaction carries enormous consequences. They can breathe, they can relax, and for perhaps the first time, closeness begins feeling less threatening. Then comes a moment many people never expect. The avoidant notices, not necessarily immediately, not dramatically, Sometimes they notice through absence, sometimes through a subtle change in energy, sometimes through a feeling they can't quite explain. The person who once seemed constantly available is no longer orbiting around them. The endless attempts to pull them closer have stopped. The emotional intensity that once followed them everywhere has faded. And suddenly something unexpected happens. Curiosity begins replacing certainty. Human beings often become accustomed to patterns, even avoidance. They become accustomed to the chase. They become accustomed to someone always reaching out first, always initiating repair, always carrying the emotional labor. When that pattern disappears, it creates space for awareness. The avoidant begins noticing the silence where pressure used to exist. They begin noticing the freedom they once fought so hard to protect is now being freely given. Ironically, this freedom often creates a feeling they haven't experienced in a long time, a desire to move closer on their own terms. Not because they are being manipulated, not because they are losing control, but because genuine connection can finally exist without feeling forced. This is why silence can sometimes communicate more powerfully than words. Not hostile silence, not silence designed to punish, not silence intended to provoke guilt. Genuine emotional detachment carries a completely different energy. It is quiet confidence, it is acceptance, it is the willingness to release your grip on outcomes you cannot control. Most people underestimate how strongly others can feel this shift. When someone is chasing, there is tension in the connection. Even if their words are loving, the underlying energy says, "Please choose me, please reassure me, please make me feel safe." But when someone becomes emotionally centered within themselves, that tension disappears. There is nothing to prove, nothing to force, nothing to demand. And because the pressure disappears, the avoidance nervous system stops bracing for impact. They stop anticipating difficult conversations around every corner. They stop expecting emotional demands they don't know how to meet. Instead of feeling pulled toward a responsibility, they begin feeling drawn toward a connection. That difference may seem subtle, but psychologically it changes everything. One creates resistance, the other creates possibility. As the pressure fades, another remarkable process begins unfolding inside the avoidant. Their defenses start lowering. For a long time, those defenses existed for a reason. They were protecting against perceived threats, expectations, dependence, emotional intensity, loss of freedom. But defenses are expensive. They require energy to maintain. They require constant vigilance. When the environment begins feeling safer, the need for those defenses gradually decreases. This doesn't happen overnight. Avoidants rarely wake up transformed. Yet little by little their guard starts dropping. Conversations feel easier. Responses become warmer. Presence becomes more consistent. The walls that once seemed impossible to penetrate begin developing small openings. What's important to understand is that this isn't happening because someone finally convinced them to stay. It's happening because the emotional landscape around them has changed. The relationship is no longer built on pursuit and retreat. It is no longer fueled by anxiety and resistance. Instead, it begins operating from a place of freedom and choice. And freedom is something avoidants understand far better than pressure. But perhaps the most important change is the one happening inside you. Because while the avoidance defenses are lowering, your dependence on their behavior is lowering too. You are no longer measuring your worth through their responses. You are no longer trapped in the exhausting cycle of seeking signs, analyzing every interaction, and trying to predict what comes next. You begin experiencing something that may have been missing for a very long time: peace. Not because you know how the story ends, not because every uncertainty has disappeared, but because your emotional stability is no longer attached to someone else's ability to stay close. And from that place of peace, you start seeing the situation with greater clarity than ever before. You begin recognizing something that was always there but difficult to see while you were chasing. The avoidant has been fighting a battle of their own, a battle between longing and fear, a battle between wanting connection and fearing what connection might require. And in the next part of this journey, that hidden conflict will finally come into full view. The deeper you begin seeing this dynamic, the harder it becomes to view the avoidant as simply someone who doesn't care. Because beneath the distance, beneath the mixed signals, beneath the frustrating push and pull behavior, there is often an internal conflict that remains completely invisible to the outside world. Most people only see the withdrawal. They don't see the battle that may be happening behind it. They don't see the moments when the avoidant misses someone but refuses to reach out. They don't see the conversations replaying in their mind long after they appear emotionally detached. They don't see the strange loneliness that can exist even while maintaining distance. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidance. The avoidant is frequently caught between two opposing forces. One part wants connection, warmth, intimacy, and companionship. Another part fears vulnerability, dependence, obligation, and emotional exposure. Neither side fully wins. Instead, they pull against each other. When connection grows stronger, fear becomes activated. When distance grows larger, longing begins to surface. This internal tug-of-war can continue for years because the avoidant often lacks a clear path toward resolving it. From the outside, their behavior appears inconsistent. From the inside, it often feels confusing to them as well. They move away to feel safe, only to discover that safety sometimes comes with loneliness. They seek distance to reduce pressure, only to find themselves missing the very connection they escaped from. That is why some avoidants unexpectedly reappear after periods of withdrawal. It can seem completely random when it happens. Weeks pass, sometimes months. The silence becomes normal. Then suddenly a message arrives, a reaction appears, a conversation starts. Many people interpret this moment as proof that the avoidant has finally changed. They immediately assume the struggle is over and the relationship is about to become everything they hoped it would be. But understanding why an avoidant returns is crucial. Sometimes they return because genuine reflection has occurred. Sometimes they return because enough time has passed for their nervous system to feel safe again. Sometimes they return because they have started confronting their own fears. But other times they return simply because distance has activated their longing. The same person who once felt overwhelmed by closeness may now feel the absence of that connection. This is why returning and transforming are not the same thing. A returning avoidant is not automatically a healed avoidant. The desire for connection may have resurfaced, but the underlying fears may still be present beneath the surface. Understanding this distinction protects you from falling back into old patterns, because if you assume their return means everything is fixed, you may unknowingly recreate the exact dynamic that caused the cycle in the first place. And this brings us to one of the most important moments in the entire journey, the test that most people fail. After spending weeks or months learning to reclaim their emotional center, they see the avoidant return and instantly abandon everything they have built. The moment attention comes back, old fears rush forward. The moment warmth returns, old habits awaken. Suddenly they begin monitoring again, overanalyzing again, prioritizing the relationship above their own stability again. It's understandable. After all, they care deeply. They want the connection to succeed. They don't want to lose it. But the irony is painful. The very behavior that once created balance gets replaced by the behavior that once created pressure. The dynamic slowly shifts back toward pursuit. The avoidant begins sensing familiar expectations, familiar emotional dependency, familiar intensity, and before long, the same cycle begins rebuilding itself. This is why maintaining your center after reconnection is often harder than finding it in the first place. Anyone can step back when they feel rejected. The true challenge is staying emotionally grounded when things finally seem to be improving. Because lasting change is not proven during separation, it is proven during reconnection. The people who navigate this stage successfully discover something powerful. They learn how to remain open without becoming attached to outcomes. They learn how to care without clinging. They learn how to love without losing themselves. This balance is what healthy emotional strength actually looks like. Many people confuse strength with detachment. They believe becoming strong means becoming cold, distant, or indifferent. But genuine emotional maturity looks very different. It allows warmth without dependency. It allows affection without desperation. It allows vulnerability without self-abandonment. Imagine interacting with the avoidant from a place where you genuinely enjoy their presence but do not require it to feel whole. Imagine being capable of appreciating the connection without constantly fearing its loss. That energy changes everything, not because it manipulates the avoidant, but because it transforms the foundation of the relationship itself. The avoidant no longer feels responsible for regulating your emotional state. You no longer feel responsible for managing theirs. Two people begin meeting as individuals rather than as emotional survival systems, trying to stabilize each other. For many avoidants, this is one of the safest relational experiences they will ever encounter. As this new dynamic develops, something else starts becoming visible. Confidence. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, not the confidence that comes from pretending not to care. Real confidence is much quieter. It emerges when your self-worth is no longer tied to someone else's choices. It appears when you stop measuring your value through another person's availability. It grows when you realize that your life remains meaningful regardless of whether a particular relationship succeeds or fails. This kind of confidence has an almost magnetic quality because it is rooted in truth rather than performance. People can feel the difference. Avoidance especially can feel the difference. Why? Because confidence removes hidden pressure. It removes the subtle emotional contracts that often exist beneath relationships. The unspoken agreements that say, I need you to behave a certain way so I can feel okay. When confidence is present, those agreements disappear. The connection becomes lighter, freer, more authentic. And this is where many avoidants begin experiencing something unexpected. Attraction starts increasing, not because they are being chased, not because they are being convinced, not because someone is trying harder. Attraction grows because emotional safety has increased. There is room to approach without feeling trapped, room to connect without feeling consumed, room to stay present without feeling controlled. The person they once felt pressure from now feels like a source of calm, and calm has a way of drawing people closer than pursuit ever can. This doesn't mean every avoidant suddenly becomes fully available. It doesn't mean